Nom Nom delivers fresh food with whole ingredients backed by veterinarian science. Science tells us that a dog's health starts in the bowl, so improving their diet is one of the best ways to help them live a long and happy life. Nom Nom's food is full of proteins your dog loves and the vitamins and nutrients they need to thrive. All you have to do is order, pour, and serve. Ready to make the switch to fresh? Order Nom Nom today. Go to https://trynom.com/curveball and get 50% off your first order plus free shipping. That's https://trynom.com/curveball. Plus, Nom Nom comes with a money-back guarantee. If your dog's tail isn't wagging within 30 days, Nom Nom will refund your first order. No fillers, no nonsense, just Nom Nom. Welcome to the Living the Dream podcast with Curveball. If you believe, you can achieve. Welcome to the Living the Dream with Curveball podcast, a show where I interview guests that teach, motivate, and inspire. Today, I am joined by award-winning investigative reporter, podcast host, and digital media entrepreneur, Robert Riggs. Robert has a reputation of his reporting being tough, fair, accurate, and he has credibility. Robert, with his reporting, has done things like send corrupt politicians and government officials to federal prison. He was also one of the reporters that was with the embedded with the unit, the Army unit that led the Iraq invasion in 2003. So we're going to be talking to him about his story and see what he's up to now. Robert, thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, Curtis, howdy from Dallas, and good to talk to you there in Kansas.
Absolutely. Why don't you start off by telling everybody a little bit about yourself?
Well, I'm a native of Texas, born in a small town in East Texas, working class family, really the first in my part of family to be able to go to school. I'm the product of Depression era children who were World War II veterans, everybody in the family. Everybody saw hard times during the Depression. Everybody worked with their back. My dad always used to tell me, I learned to work with your brain and not your back like we do. I was fortunate enough to Texas A&M University. This is back when A&M was primarily a military school. My uncle had gone there and got called up to World War II when he was there. But it was an engineering, agriculture, science school. It was a difficult school. And that really did a lot shaping me for the future. I'd really never been a kind of outgoing person. I wouldn't have been ever voted most popular in high school. Matter of fact, I was rejected by most of the girls. But there, I sort of found my stride, and I ran for student government. It was a student senator. And then that led me to get a job in Congress and go to work for the member of Congress that started the Watergate investigation. And that led me on an investigative path in Congress and in a committee, which then really opened up the world of broadcast journalism to me. And so today, that's behind me, and I do a true crime podcast called True Crime Reporter, where we do procedurals and we interview. When you hear our crime stories, you're going to hear it from the detectives, FBI agents, U.S. Marshals, the sheriffs, Texas Rangers, you name it, the ones that were involved in it. And so it's very different from most true crime podcasts. And we've already spun one podcast series off into a television documentary on a streaming channel and are working on more. And we're having a lot of fun still.
That is absolutely great. So you were embedded with the Army unit that led the invasion in 2003 in the Iraq War. So kind of tell us about that, what that was like and how you got that job.
Well, I had done two wars before that. I went down and covered some of the Contras during the Reagan administration. This was really a proxy war between the United States and the Soviet Union. They were supporting the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. And Reagan was financing a band of basically mercenaries from the area, if you get down to it. And that fight went down. I covered that. And then I went to Gulf War One and was embedded in the beginning of that. And then in 2003, I was embedded with starting with it's called the 552 ADA. It was an air defense unit. It was Patriot missile batteries. And I didn't know this was going to happen, but when I got in country, we found out that they would be right at the tip of the spear because there was great fear that Saddam had chemical weapons. I remember the whole weapons of mass destruction thing, and that the rest of the army couldn't come. The 101st Airborne, which was based near us in Kuwait, that they couldn't come. They were worried that there would be a chemical attack and their helicopters would get, quote, slimed, and they couldn't fly. Probably couldn't fly in the chemical warfare suits when you got down to it. They were very uncomfortable, very hot. And so that was an amazing experience. I did some time there with the 101st Airborne. I was only there at the beginning. The unit I was with suffered the first casualties of the war, but I wasn't there when it really got bad a few years later, when the roadside bombs started and the other side figured out, how the U.S. government and Army operated on schedules and stuff, and they just began taking advantage of our routine, so to speak. But when I came out of there, I did a lot of terrorism reporting. My producer and I went to London and around Great Britain covering terrorism as well. So we broke a lot of ground on terrorism. We had a terrorism blog that had a huge following. We were the first to uncover how Al Qaeda was videoing their bombings and then putting them into YouTube, unbeknownst to YouTube, to recruit other suicide bombers. And that's what had led us to London, too. There were some groups there outside of London who were aiding in that effort. And so it was quite an experience.
Okay, well, your bio says that you were also responsible for putting corrupt politicians and government officials in prison. You kind of touched on that a little bit with Watergate. So kind of go deeper into it and tell the listeners work that you've done in that realm.
So Curtis, I kind of swung back and forth between kind of you'd say general assignment reporting or more specialized reporting. So when I was I started in New York, and I did investigative reporting there for a CBS station. And then I went to Washington, D.C., where I ran a bureau. And in those days, I was covering the Reagan White House and later George H.W. Bush. I was covering political campaigns. I covered Jesse Jackson's race for the presidency out on his campaign trail some. And I covered Congress, State Department, the Pentagon. I always, just because of my background, when I worked in Congress, I ended up as a staffer on one of the defense committees. And so between that and the background at Texas A&M, it was a military school, I just found national security issues really interesting to cover. It was hard in terms of those days we didn't really have the technology that exists today. No cell phones, none of that sort of stuff. And it really wore on you trying to cover stories, do stories. It was long, long days. And it was 7 days a week. So there was a real burnout. So I then went to Austin, Texas to run a bureau for a chain of stations. It was the Texas State House. I'm back in Texas, which I really had loved. And it was to be a kind of laid back experience in those days. Everybody wore sport coats, blue jeans, and cowboy boots on the floor of the House and Senate. And the Texas Capitol is a beautiful place. I recommend anybody ever visiting Austin, go see it. Lots of historical artwork in ornate wood carvings of the fixtures and everything. Is really, really a neat place. But I went there thinking that, okay, I'm going to kind of cool it. And I found myself smack dab in uncovering a huge, huge scandal, which is really part of this is the reason I do this podcast today. I discovered that the parole board was selling paroles in Texas. And everybody thought this was a big law and order state. Well, they were letting them go left and right here. And it was a combination of political corruption and then good old fashioned money. And I discovered that they had let 68 former death row inmates, these are people who had been on death row, and their sentences had been commuted to life when the Supreme Court struck down the death penalty in 1972. Now, they would eventually become eligible for parole, but nobody ever imagined when you looked at what a lot of these people had done. I mean, most of them were psychopaths. You'd never imagine they'd let them out. Well, indeed, they let them out. I found out they'd let them out, and some went out the door by greasing palms. And the poster boy for all of this was a guy had been on death row named Kenneth Allen McDuff. And I would later learn that McDuff, and I learned this from one of the members of the behavioral science unit at the FBI who helped me, named Roy Hazelwood. McDuff was what was classified as a sadistic sexual serial killer, which meant that his first priority was torturing his victims and torturing them for hours and hours sadistically, as well as the sex. And he was described to me in that category by the FBI as the great white shark of serial killers, the most difficult category to catch. He made Ted Bundy, everybody who's Ted Bundy is, he made Ted Bundy look like a choir boy. And he was out. And literally the day he had walked out of prison, the next day he started murdering again. He was murdering sex workers who, unfortunately were in that work because they had drug habits, but they were accessible. They worked in certain areas of town on the streets. But then he also started abducting women as well. Clerks at service stations, convenience stores, a young woman, a professional accountant out of a car wash and, Plainview in Austin, Texas. And so I really got onto that. And that turned into a huge story of my life, one of the biggest stories of my career, and literally lasted for almost 10 years. And I transitioned from that into terrorism reporting and then went to the war. But I dusted off all my reporter's notebooks from back in those days, started calling homicide detectives and others that had never talked about the case. And I got everybody to sit down and I did a podcast. I did a 17-episode podcast, which became a television show called Freed to Kill. It's a streaming show on Fox Nation. And it won a lot of awards. It was a hit there. And as a result, in the midst of, pre-production of more shows around really horrible Texas crimes, everything's bigger in Texas, especially the crime. So that's what's really had me going. And since I really got into it, I had lots of law enforcement sources in that day, and they've all kind of come out of the woodwork, and their friends have come out of the woodwork about, hey, boy, do we have a story for you. And these are not street cops. These are, seasoned detectives, ATF agents, U.S. Marshals, that category who, worked murder. Murder was their business. So in the midst of all of that, in a break of all of that, of coming back from the war, and I ended up doing a big investigative story around my work in Iraq. I did a big investigative piece of how oil was being stolen right under our noses and put into the black market. I did an expose, a big investigative story of how the weapon system, the Patriot missile system, failed when I was there and shot down friendly aircraft and killed the crews. And the Army had tried to cover it up. They forgot there was an embedded reporter in their midst during all this who had witnessed everything. And that ended up on 60 Minutes. And then I did and all through my career, off and on, I've done your garden variety political corruption at City Hall or in state government. and have actually my reporting and that of my producer. I had a terrific producer named Todd Bensman I worked with. We sent some people to the federal penitentiary who needed to go. So I have to say that there was for us always a great satisfaction in that we saw fruits of our reporting. We thought that good came of it, that shining that light on a dark place in society did something.
Absolutely, and definitely thank you for all that you've done. You are a award-winning reporter, so tell us about the awards that you won and what they mean, because I know they're definitely very important.
Well, I received a Peabody Award. Now, the Peabody Award for television, it's really kind of the television's Oscar is what it is, because it doesn't just go to investigative reporting, it goes to documentaries and what have you. And when I received mine, my luncheon mate sitting for 3 hours beside me was Oprah. And these were the days that she was really starting to become big. And Dan Rather was at the table of CBS. There were some other producers of shows, and it was just sort of an incredible time to be, sitting among these greats. And I want to tell you, I loved Oprah, loved her. The nicest. I don't know what she is today, but I want to tell you, I mean, I spent a lot of time there. She was very sweet, open woman. And listen, this ceremony takes place in New York City, and she was the toast of New York. Before things really got underway, there was a line of network executives lined up kind of to pay homage to her, to say hello, to shake her hand. And meanwhile, here sits Dan Rather and others from CBS 60 Minutes. they're kind of getting a, well, hello, but it was all Oprah's show. So that was great. I've won some DuPont Columbia Awards. That is basically the broadcast journalism's equivalent of the Pulitzer Prize, what we would think of for print. And I received 3 of those. And all 3, well, 2 were for corruption. Government, just plain old government corruption, and 1 was for my coverage of the Gulf War. And a lot of people don't know this, but what the award was for, I got kicked out before the war started, because I learned that the U.S. government had done a deal with the Saudis that there would be no prayer, no religious services for U.S. soldiers. And I got there and I found out this was an open secret among the media, but the networks and all have been told, if you do this story, you're not going to have access. You're not going to be in here. And I got there and started seeing this. I will never forget one night we were in a tent, crew and I, and we're rolling video. We're talking to soldiers. These are private first class, about their experiences, where they're from, and all of this. And I just will never forget, there was this African-American soldier from Chicago. And he said, I just want to ask one thing. Why can't I get down on my knee and pray to my God like I was taught in the church in Chicago before we go into war? And suddenly some higher ranking enlisted people, an officer grabbed him and just dragged him out of the tent, furious. Well, I've rolled on all of it. I've got it all. And I already had other stuff. I'd picked up other things going on. I'd already had a chaplain pull me aside and say, look what's going on here. Somebody's got to do something about this. He said, I can't wear my cross on my collar. I'm having to wear it unseen under the collar. And I'm now called, they said, I'm a morale officer. I can't say I'm a chaplain. Then I ran into some other soldiers, and it was Christmas time too, by the way, coming up on Christmas. And they were Jewish, and they couldn't practice their religion or put up any symbols out. And many had been told, tell your families not to send Christmassy cards for Christmas. Well, how do you do that? And I'd already been gathering this. I had collected tape all over the place. The media minders were unaware of. But after this happened, and man, they were really treating this kid badly. And we're there. And they said to me, you're not going to use that, are you? And I said, you're damn right I'm going to use it. It's going on TV. And They said, well, you'll be out of here in the morning. You'll be out. And they're kicking us out of Saudi. We were in northern Saudi Arabia. And a colonel, and we were there covering first cav, which was tanks, armored. And one of the colonels of the brigade commanders had heard about it. He came over and he said, listen, I've heard what's happened. I don't have control over that, but I'll tell you what, you haven't been here long enough to tell the story of my troops and what they're doing here. And you got to do this. Their families want to see what they're doing and everything. And so we hooked up. He got a Humvee for us, and he said, just follow me. And so for days, we were eluding the media minders who were on the hunt for us out in the desert trying to find us. And so we were out getting just great stories, getting great tape. And then about 5 days, they caught up with us, furious, and took us into custody and took us to, what was it, Riyadh. It took us to one of the Air Force bases and put us on a C-5A for home. And when we touched down, I started on those stories, and it caused the stories caused a firestorm because this is when I was in Washington. And so I called Edward Luttwak. Ed was a very distinguished kind of Pentagon consultant. In those days, he was on, Ted Koppel would have him on all the time on Nightline to talk about strategic matters. And I called him because I'd interviewed him and stuff. And I said, hey, let me tell you what's going on, what's happened to me. And he said, this is awful. He said, I've been hearing about this in my synagogue. You've got to do this story. And the deal is that the Saudis have made a deal with the Wahhabis, and the Wahhabis were the really strict practitioners of Islam. And he said, look, you can't have a Christian church in Islam, or a Jewish church for that matter. But they've made this deal with the devil, and you need to tell this story. And so I went over and I got an interview with a Pentagon spokesperson, and he starts, putting out the party line about we don't want to be accused of being the infidels in that country and all. And then I pointed out, well, there are Christian churches in Iraq. And oh, by the way, the foreign minister of Iraq is a Christian. And then I brought up the other stuff, and he got cotton mouth, and I just caught him flat footed. I mean, he just was a meltdown on camera, put the story on the air, and it caused a firestorm. Even Walter Cronkite came up and testified in Congress. He brought it up. And so within a few days, that ban on religious services and the practice of religion had been lifted. And so that was great satisfaction. Now, fast forward, 9/11. And I'll never forget covering it. And suddenly you hear that the 19 hijackers, what are they practice? They're Wahhabi. The same guys I had tangled with years and years earlier, and it caused me to get thrown out. So when I got the DuPont Award for the story, they said it was the story that everyone missed. And I corrected them. I said, no. It was a story everyone else chose not to cover because they were afraid what happened to me would happen to them. Now, once I did that story, they all unleashed, all the networks and everybody. Boy, some like CNN, they ran my story. Others, ABC ran my story and stuff. And they had no fear because when the Pentagon complained, they were like, well, no, Riggs did it. It was Riggs' fault, not our fault. He did it. So that was one of kind of the high points. That was really satisfying to, just see change for good.
Good job on that. Let the listeners know. I know you have this these shows that you're working on right now, but let us know what else upcoming projects that you're working on that we need to know about.
Well, I've got a number of podcast series we're working on, and I think what we're going to start doing out of this, some audio books. So I've got a legendary detective in New York who ended up being an advisor to some of the major motion pictures shot in New York and elsewhere, including The Godfather, The French Connection. And he was such a great technical consultant. They put him in the movies, and he left the police department eventually, and he's got over 50 movie credits. I mean, major parts in movies with Frank Sinatra and others. And so we've been doing some stuff with his stories. It's just a fascinating thing about Hollywood. I've already had an episode on where, the The car chase in The French Connection is considered one of the all-time great car chases. He was in the car, and he tells the inside story of how that took place. And they did it with no permits, and they did it in real live traffic. And when the bus and other things, that's really happening. Nobody else knew. I mean, this is unheard of today. You never hear of this happening today. I'm working on a podcast series and a television show about a case called The Railroad Killer. This was a man from Mexico for years who was coming across the border, riding the rails across America, committing crimes, and was escalated. And then he just started this murder rampage in the late 90s that was so bad that he bumped Osama bin Laden off the FBI's top 10 most wanted list. And it's a fascinating story of how they got them, but it's also really going to take an approach of the mind of this killer because, the brutality and the crazy stuff. I mean, there's traits of like Charles Manson of, murdering people and then writing in their blood on walls and stuff. So that's one. And there's others like that we're working on. There's another television show about a execution of the chief district attorney and his chief prosecutor over at a small East Texas town, unheard of. I mean, they were assassinated. And for the longest, they thought it was the Aryan Brotherhood gang. I'm working on a project that'll take you just into the darkest recesses of the Texas prison system with the reputed hitman for the Aryan Brotherhood, who's out now, did 44 years. And back when I was doing my corruption stuff, he was one of my best sources for all the corruption because through the gang, they have a network. They knew everything that was going on. And he's an interesting character. He took every trade school and college class you could take in the Texas prison system. He devoured books. I mean, constantly. He was in solitary most of the time. He's always reading. And he had an IQ of a genius. And so we're talking about doing something about looking. I mean, he saw the different sides of the prison system, its most violent side to the changes that took place. Heck, he'd been around Kenneth McDuff, the serial killer I taught you about. So it'll be a different perspective. And, the thing that I always found interesting, he's an Aryan Brotherhood member, reputed, never really kind of owe up to it, but he's got all, he had all the tattoos and everything. And, but in all my dealings with him, there was never one racial slur. Nothing ever slipped. And you would have thought that it would at least slipped, but it never did. And so I want to get into that with him. Wait a minute, you had friends growing up that were African-American, you're from a poor family. What was this? Was this just a con to get by? So I'm looking forward to that because it's just so different. I mean, a prison is a completely different culture, and they talk about what's outside the walls. They call it the free world in prison. So during my investigation into corruption, I was inside about almost every maximum security prison in the state of Texas. You can't do that anymore. With what had happened, I think they were so afraid of my reporting what was going on. They were afraid to say no. And so I went everywhere. I saw the whole underbelly of the system. And, and that frankly, there's a lot that still bothers me about it. The disparity between, minorities and the number of whites that are in. I got a big award from the FBI for my reporting. And it was, there's a big group of people there, and they had asked me to speak. It kind of shocked the room. I said, I got to tell you something. We got the biggest prison system in the world. You know what that is? That's a big monument to the failure of education in this state. And as I've looked back on my experiences, the number of inmates I've talked to, there's a lot of inmates there because of learning differences, I think. My wife works in that world of learning differences. And I look back on it and I was like, if there'd just been some intervention, something to help them young, God, what could we have done? So that's the sort of stuff. Again, the true podcast is True Crime Reporter. You will hear some straight crime stories. Others are interviews. We just this week is the second part of a two-part series with a member of the original NCIS, the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, that's featured on television and is so popular. And he's the real deal. And he started the first cold case unit in the federal government that was with NCIS. And he traveled the world investigating crimes that would involve sailors and Marines, as up to officers, all corruption, murder, mostly murder. And so he's an expert on murder. And we're now actually thinking about trying to do a television show together because he's retired, but he hasn't quit. He's just an invaluable source of information. So he and a group of retired officers go around the country and they help small departments that are stumped by murder cases. And they go in free, it's a nonprofit, and help them try to solve cases. And there are some homicides. I mean, they really, really are difficult. These guys and gals, they've seen it all. And there's forensics experts that work with them. So we're thinking about something where we'll be a kind of fly on the wall, go with them and show the public how this kind of takes place. So we're full of ideas. There's not enough time in the day these days. But again, True Crime Reporter, that's the podcast. And we're an Apple, Spotify, anywhere you can hear a podcast, we're there.
Well, do you have a website or anything so that we can keep up with your ideas and check out everything that you're up to?
The website is truecrimereporter.com. You can listen to the podcast there as well. There's a podcast player. You can go there and start in the player and then subscribe to, if you're an Android user, there's a link there to how to subscribe to on your Android phone, or like I said, we try to make it open to everyone. We did a two-part series around Uvalde, and the first part was in both of these parts, I had the FBI agent, and she was an FBI in management as well, special agent, who conducted the landmark active shooter study for the FBI and then built the training program. She was amazing amount of knowledge about this epidemic of mass shootings and the profile of the shooters. So we came on and we had a long piece about the profile and what's going on, and it's massive, the increase in it. And then when the security tape and all came out, she broke that down and about all of the failures, and she was appalled. I mean, the FBI had spent millions of dollars through her unit, training money, and they didn't do what they were trained in. It's just shocking. Now, we just had an incident a few weeks ago here in Dallas at a mall in Allen, Texas, where a guy pulled up paramilitary gear and just got out with an assault rifle and started randomly killing people. And there happened to be a police officer that he had some sort of traffic stop or something on the other side of the mall. And he heard the gunfire, and it's all on body cam. He does what you're supposed to do. He runs to the fire, but he grabs his assault rifle out of his unit and starts running and is talking and trying to isolate where it's coming from. And he did an amazing job. I mean, he ran a long ways. You can hear him huffing and puffing. And then he gets there and he shoots the guy. I got trained in shooting by the military when I was with the Congressional Committee. And I'm telling you, to run and then to have that adrenaline drop of when you're facing a deadly situation and do what he did, amazing. I hope he's going to get some kind of commendation because he saved a lot of lives. He saved a lot of lives out there alone. Amazing, amazing officer. So, it's just a wide variety of stuff. And I always ask the audience, hey, what do you want to hear about? So we drop an episode every Tuesday. This Tuesday's episode is about road rage. Road rage violence is like quadrupled in America. I mean, it is an epidemic. People are getting mad at each other in traffic and killing each other, getting out and having gunfights. It's happened here in Dallas. It's happening all over the country. But interestingly, the worst city in America is Houston, and the worst state in America is Texas. And of course, We love our guns in Texas. I'm sure that, everybody's packing. I always tell my friends, you better not be honking at that guy that's cut you off in traffic and losing your temper, because you might get shot. And it's really become true. I'll tell you how crazy it is. There was a 31-year-old driving with his 2-year-old in a car seat, and he gets aggravated and, in traffic at someone, and they flipped him off. He's rolling down the highway shooting at them. He wounds them, and then a woman not involved, a 65-year-old woman not involved in this, in another car, she is shot and critically wounded. You can't make this stuff up. It's crazy. So we've done a piece about the increase, to build awareness for the increase, and what's going on? Why are people so angry? And then we've got another piece that's coming up on outlaw motorcycle gangs. A lot of people don't know there's a war going on here in the Southwest with the Bandito motorcycle gang and other gangs, and it's deadly. I mean, they've shot each other off the highway, and it started a few years ago in Waco, Texas, at a Twin Peaks restaurant where there was a huge shootout, and it's continued to go on. Payback, back and forth. One of the things we haven't done, I've got to line it up to start research, is that we have an epidemic of young men, teenagers, being involved in gun crimes, shooting each other, shooting somebody, robbery, whatever. I mean, wow. It is, it's like the wild, wild west out there. I'm not exaggerating. So that's kind of what's coming up on tap.
All right, listeners. What an amazing interview. Amazing stories from Robert. Be sure you check him out at truecrimereporter.com. Follow, rate, review. Share this episode to all of your true crime friends out there, and to everybody. If you have any guests or suggestion topics, cjackson102 at cox.net is the place to send them. As usual, thank you for listening. And Robert, thank you for this amazing interview.
Curtis, thank you. And as we like to say at the close of our podcast, stay safe, stay alert, and stay tuned to the True Crime Reporter podcast.
For more information on the Living the Dream podcast, visit www.djcurveball.com. Until next time, stay focused on living the dream.